Iran, which is a country which will have weapons of mass destruction, I believe.
Pretty whereas France, here Sarkozy, as one of the most outspoken critics of the Iranian regime. But why is it only on the shoulders of the U.S. and Israel? After the bombings in Spain and Mumbai and the UK, why haven't other countries woken up to the Iranian threat? And if they have, is there any hope they will rush to our aid and in some way help destabilize the Iranian regime?
Well, I think there is a lot of support for tough policies. By the way, one country that's emerged as one of Israel's best friends recently has been Canada. And the current Prime Minister of Canada, who's a great friend of Israel. But who would have imagined 100 years ago that Israel's best friends in the world are Poland, Czechoslovakia, and its worst enemies in the world are Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland. France is, I think, more on the friend side. Spain, it depends on who's in office. I think the conservatives would have won the Spanish election but for the terrorist attack in the train station, and now the socialists are in power and they're not friends with Israel. Italy is a great friend of Israel's. The leaders of most Western European countries are very supportive of Israel and very supportive of sanctions. And by the way, many of them now regard Barack Obama as a weak president. They didn't like Bush, but they regard Barack Obama as a weak president. And he's not having a good relationship. He's lost a lot of his credibility among European leaders. He still has a lot of credibility among European people. And so the leaders haven't been able to really come out as forcefully against him as many of them believe. This has not been a successful first year for Barack Obama, and it's disappointing to me. I knew him as a student. I thought very well of him. I thought that he would be a much better president than he's been. He was a great campaigner. He may yet emerge as a great president, but the first year has been, I think, quite disappointing.
Given this threat of a military strike, the Iranian people would react to a military strike, and is there any hope in using that as a lever in undermining the regime?
I think it's exactly the opposite. I think that if the regime gets weaker, as it might be getting, it will actually hope for an attack by Israel. That an attack by Israel, which wouldn't be a complete attack, and it would be a moderate attack, would help strengthen the administration. The one thing that you people probably have friends in Iran and are more in close contact, but I've seen polls, whatever polls you can believe from Iran, but some independent polls suggesting that the vast majority of Iranians, even those who don't support the administration, do support Iran's ability to get nuclear weapons as a matter of national pride. And I think were Israel to attack, particularly Israel attack alone, it would only strengthen the regime. There are no simple solutions. We're talking about worse, worser, worsest, and totally destructive of world peace. So, I'm used to that. I'm a criminal lawyer, and most of my cases, the options I have are worse, worser, worsest than the death penalty. And I think what we're facing in Iran, there are no good solutions. There are only bad ones, but there are ones that are much worse than others. And what is needed now in the world is great leadership. Great leadership in Israel, great leadership in the United States, great leadership in the Western world, great leadership at the UN. Talk about oxymorons. So far, we've not seen anything close to that. And this is a time that really tries the souls of men and women, and I hope we have the leaders in place who are capable of making these very, very difficult judgment calls.
Last question on Iran before we move on to it. What about the leadership Obama has shown, or lack thereof, in terms of supporting the Iranian people? We were worried that we'd be called meddlers, and what happened is he let the protesters protest. Some suffered, some died, and yet, for the most part, Obama and the U.S. administration was silent. He came out later and spoke in favor, but not as firmly as we would have hoped. What's happening there?
Well, I think it was disappointing. I think that by the way, most American administrations have done that in terms of most freedom and dissident movements. It happened in China, it happened in Russia, it happened in Chechnya, it's happened. Americans, although we talk a good game of human rights, we don't generally stand behind our promises. This is not surprising. Look at Cuba, of course. We spoke a good game in Cuba, and then we sent people to the slaughter and Bay of Pigs and didn't do anything to protect the Cuban people. So we've had a long, long and pretty despicable history of not standing behind our rhetoric of human rights. And I think it was a shame that the administration didn't do more. I think it was a shame the United Nations didn't do more. And I think a lot of wonderful Iranian, very, very heroic people will die as the result of our unwillingness to stand up. And look, the Obama administration has had a policy of trying to reach out, a policy of trying to not use language like the axis of evil or Islamo-fascist or all of that. And I support that. I support that. I had hoped that the Obama administration's policy would have been, the metaphor for it would have been the way the United States government dealt with the Somali pirates. Remember, they took American prisoners, and we talked, we negotiated, we took them at face value, we were very serious, and then when they looked like they were about to kill Americans, we shot them in the head and killed them. And to me, that's the metaphor. You talk, you negotiate, you reach out, you try every alternative short of deadly force. But if it's you versus them, and if it's our people in harm's way, and if it's democracy versus tyranny, you do whatever you have to do to protect innocent victims of tyranny against, what I'm seeing is the language but not the action. It's an early time in the administration, but no administration, few administrations have been tested. You know, my hope, my optimism, I'm an optimist by nature, is maybe the Obama administration will get a victory in terms of health care, and maybe that will give them some more courage. Let me tell you my fear. My fear is that if they fail on health care, and that's possible, I hope they will succeed, but whether they succeed or fail on health care, I think they see peace in the Middle East as a political chip to be won, rather than as a process that will guarantee long-term peace. What I'm very worried about is the Obama administration needs a victory. And they think they can pressure Israel into giving them a victory by making a peace in the Middle East which doesn't serve Israel's long-term interest. Now, if it means giving up the settlements, hey, I'm all for that. But if it means sacrificing Israel's security one iota, I'm categorically against that. In the end, Israelis have to make these decisions. Israelis decided in 2000 and 2001 that they would take a chance and risk giving back all of the Gaza, 97% of the West Bank, divided Jerusalem, Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, $35 billion reparation package, and the Israelis supported that. A close vote, but the polls showed the Israelis supported that. The Palestinian people supported that. Yasser Arafat, advised by Jimmy Carter, refused to accept that. We could today be celebrating the 10th anniversary of Palestinian statehood if those two SOBs, Yasser Arafat and Jimmy Carter, hadn't gotten together and decided that it would take too much courage to make a real peace. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize after it was known that he discouraged Arafat from accepting Camp David and Taba. That is a disgrace to the Nobel Committee.
I've got a couple last questions that we're going to open up to Q&A, followed by a book signing by Alan Dershowitz. And as you know, Iran has recently sought to seek to be elected to the UN Human Rights Council. Our friend, the Iranian foreign minister, said last June's elections were an exemplary exhibition of democracy and freedom. What's going on here? Why is Israel getting such a bad rap? What is Israel doing wrong? Why is there no more condemnation of countries like Iran? And what should Israel be doing better?
Well, what Israel should be doing better is presenting its case more effectively. Israel does not do a good job in presenting its case. I mean, how many people on college campuses know today that Israel per capita exports more life-saving medical technology than any country in the world? How many people are aware of what Israel did in Haiti? The first people on the ground, opening up a field hospital, saving lives. One of the people, a doctor from the Israeli medics, came over and delivered a baby who was named Israel. And that man is now being accused of being a war criminal in Gaza, instead of looking at the lives he saved. Read a book people say they're happy I wrote my book, The Case for Israel. There's a better book on Israel to read. It's by Dan Senior, and it's called Startup Nation. And it's all about what Israel has done miraculously in the area of high technology startups, particularly in the area of medical technology. I've had the privilege of representing one of the Israeli high-tech companies that helped invent the stent that saved many, many lives, the stent for the heart. Israel does amazing, amazing things. No country in the history of the world, none, has ever accomplished more in 61 years than Israel has in its first 61 years. No country. Compare Israel's accomplishments to the United States. The United States, in 61 years after it was established, was a backwater nation. It was a great potential, but a backwater nation. Think of other countries in the world that have come into existence recently. No country has come close to what Israel has accomplished. Israel has the best record of human rights of any country facing comparable threats of terrorism from its neighbors who hide behind civilians. And that you read the Goldstone report. Read today's New York Times about how many civilians have died in Afghanistan as a result of fire from NATO troops, American troops, British troops. There's no Goldstone report on Afghanistan. There's no Goldstone report on Iraq. There was no Goldstone report on Chechnya. There's no Goldstone report on Tibet. There's no Goldstone report on Rwanda. There was no Goldstone report on Darfur. There's only one Goldstone report, only about Israel, which made 100,000 phone calls, dropped 1 million leaflets to protect civilians, developed a new technique which cost them a fortune of roof knocking, in which they dropped a non-lethal bomb on the roof to make a knocking noise to warn people to leave so that the house could be destroyed because it was containing weapons and enemy soldiers. As Colonel Kemp, who was the head of our NATO forces in Afghanistan, said, no nation, no army in the history of warfare has ever done more to protect civilians than Israel. And yet Israel is the only country condemned by a Goldstone report written by a despicable, ambitious man who was prepared to lie through his teeth in order to help his own career. A man who has been at my home for dinner, a man who I sat at the lunch table with many times at the Harvard Law School, Richard Goldstone, a man who uses his Jewishness as the only way he answers. When I wrote a 39-page rebuttal to the Goldstone report and asked him to debate, he said, I don't have to debate. I'm Jewish. How can I have said anything wrong? I'm Jewish. There was a 550-page report issued yesterday with videotapes, with all the documentation proving the Goldstone report's a pack of lies. He has one answer, but I'm Jewish. My daughter lives in Jerusalem. I got an honorary doctorate from Hebrew University. I'm Jewish. He puts a hechsher, a certification of kashrut, on an absolutely treif report, and he expects people to respect him for it. And that's Richard Goldstone. And it's been disgraceful that the way he's used his Jewishness as a way of certifying the acceptability of a report that's so packed with lies, and that eventually history will judge him very, very unkindly. But you're right. If you ask college students today, many around the country, they really think Israel is the worst human rights offender, when the worst is called the best. When Iran gets elected to the Human Rights Council, and Israel can't get through the front door and is only in front of the Human Rights Council as a defendant, you know something is very wrong with the concept of human rights, the way it's practiced in the world. And that hurts me deeply as somebody who's devoted my life to human rights.
I want to address another topic which I know is near and dear to your heart, and that's college campuses. We saw it when Michael Oren spoke at UC Irvine, how feckless the administration was, how dozens of Muslim students overtook the conversation. Here was what Michael Oren really wanted to say. Despite attempts by the administration to prevent it from happening, more and more students got up and protested. Same thing with Daniel Tom when he spoke at UCLA. As you look at the college campus issue around the country, what do you see when you talk to students? What do you see when you talk to administrators? What do you think we need to be doing differently so that more and more students are better informed and more in favor of the right side?
Okay, it's a very good question. Let me give you a little background on Irvine. So I was invited to Irvine a couple of years ago. In fact, I asked to speak there tomorrow, and they couldn't arrange it because I think it's spring break, because I wanted to speak there following Michael Oren. So I spoke there about 2 or 3 years ago, and it was interesting because the audience was clearly divided. There were about 1,000 people. Why do 1,000 people come to hear me speak? Because they think maybe I'll tell them whether OJ did it. So they come to hear me. I don't tell them, but then they have to listen to me on Israel. And so I looked at the audience, and it was clear. There were about 100, 150 students on this side.